Alice, a somewhat recognizable name for a few reasons, but when referenced with military equipment, immediately many people think of black metal clips, green nylon material, and a variety of pouches, packs, and straps that made up one of the most recognizable and used load-carrying systems of the 20th century. But did you know before Alice there was the M1972 and before that the LINCLOE LCE? Yes? No? Well, either way, we'll be taking a look at these three interconnected systems and how they, through a number of revisions, updates, and upgrades, eventually led to one of the most influential and used military load-carrying systems out there. Now, before moving ahead with everything, we want to give a big thanks to our sponsor Gear Rack, which helped immensely with this video. Providing quite a few Alice pieces you'll be seeing in detail a little later on, Gear Rack is the place to go to for web gear. US, Germany, Czech Republic, and France are but a few countries they have items from, as they offer individual pieces like British Desert DPM grenade pouches to entire ensembles such as a US Army UCP rifleman set system. But obviously it doesn't end there, as they also have all sorts of other military surplus and militaria, from Alice gear to Flecton parkas, so be sure to check them out at gearrack.com, and if you're a first-time buyer, remember to use the promo code UniformHistory10 at checkout to get 10% off your entire order while also helping out the channel. As always, thank you guys, and let's get to it. It's nearly the middle of May 1975. A bulk of US forces have long since withdrawn from Vietnam, with the few remaining hastily evacuating about 2 weeks prior due to the NVA's rapid offensive culminating with the fall of Saigon and the collapse of the Republic of Vietnam. And yet Marines backed up by Naval and Air Force personnel are being deployed to fight once again. However, this is far from a standard battle. Considered the final engagement of the Vietnam War, this event, which would eventually be known as the Mayaguez Incident, wasn't fought between the US and NVA, or even the Vietnamese for that matter, but rather forces of the Communist Party of Kampuchea, more commonly known as the Khmer Rouge, who, less than a month prior, had assumed power in Cambodia after achieving victory in an 8+ year-long civil war. These forces had managed to capture the US merchant ship SS Mayaguez in disputed waters, which prompted a swift and, by all accounts, rather hasty rescue mission. Operating on spotty intelligence coupled with confusion and anxiety from both sides, US Marines were sent to recapture the ship and attack the nearby island of Koh Tang, a part of present-day Cambodia, where the crew was thought to have been held, which ultimately was not the case. In the end, the ship was recaptured and the crew released to Thai officials, but at the cost of 3 US helicopters, with nearly 40 killed or missing in action, which didn't include 3 Marines who had been mistakenly left behind on the island, with eventual bits of info coming out that they had been captured and later on executed. Due to the operation being seen as a debacle in many regards, controversy as well as investigations would persist well into the 2000s. However, as far as equipment used, something interesting was observed being worn by certain Marines. Mixed among magazine pouches of the M1967 load-carrying equipment system were ones that to the untrained eye were very similar, save for one thing: pocket sections seen on either side. Known by the same name of Case Small Arms Ammunition 30 round, these would technically be part of the LINCLOE LCE system, making the Mayaguez Incident one of the earliest and possibly only instances of it being recorded in detail during a combat situation. But why just this one piece? What's so significant about it? And what exactly was the LINCLOE system? Well, it was one of the first entries in the story of Alice. LINCLOE LCE, or the Lightweight Individual Clothing and Equipment Load-Carrying Equipment System, was a part of the LINCLOE program, which itself was an overarching project initiated to improve numerous aspects of a soldier's uniform, equipment, and protective gear, as a way to modernize, improve upon, and really lighten the load of users. In a way, almost a hodgepodge of projects, LINCLOE itself isn't as straightforward as one team taking on a project, as technically it was initiated in 1966 after it received approval by the Army Materiel Command Technical Committee, but in a way really started in 1961 when officials began research and development of a lightweight rucksack and accompanying frame, which would eventually become the tropical rucksack used by forces during the Vietnam War. Because this rucksack achieved the goal of being sufficient for the environment while also being much lighter than previous pieces, many inquired if the same could be done with the cotton canvas-based M1956 load-carrying equipment, which ultimately resulted in the M1967 system, which was talked about in depth in a previous video. Anyway, being that the M1967 was technically a stopgap for use in Vietnam, work on it continued with the hopes of creating a much more fleshed out, proper, and long-lasting system. In addition to this, being as the Army was all over the place with testing and adopting new small arms such as the M14 and M16 rifles, as well as the M79 grenade launcher, pouches to carry ammunition needed to also be considered with many of these projects. This was especially the case with the M79, as USARV, or the US Army in Vietnam, requested research be started into the creation of an ammunition vest for it. In 1966, the initiation of tasks to develop ammunition vests for personnel armed with the M79, M14, and XM16E1 weapons would officially be started, which would lead to the development of the vest ammunition carrying, which was a garment made to carry 24 individual M40 grenades for the M79. These would be so successful they would remain in use by forces for decades after, and though these could be used by certain troops using the M16 and subsequent models, which could see the attachment of a 40mm grenade launcher, there was no effort into making a vest for M14 or 16 ammunition, and so that too became a part of the LINCLOE Project. Finally, it is worth mentioning, seeing as it was also a part of the LINCLOE Project, endeavors were made to create a new helmet for forces. After World War II, tests continued to try and improve the M1, but also possibly replace it by researching metals and other ballistic materials, shapes, and retention and suspension systems, which eventually made its way into LINCLOE, ultimately seeing a few test pieces being produced, but that's a whole different story. Anyway though, back to the load-carrying equipment. Towards the end of the 1960s, a new test system had to be produced. Still sort of splitting time between trying to develop and refine pieces for use in Southeast Asia, as well as ones for general and universal use, focus continued on a basic load-carrying suspension system, that being a belt and suspenders which allowed for the attaching and carrying of pouches and equipment, but also on a vest which could in a way perform the same function and possibly replace the suspenders, and a pack that would be a bit larger than the M1961 field pack, while talks of a larger one was also considered. And so between 1967 and 1972, quite a bit happened relating to the development, which sees a lot of back and forth between locations such as Natick Labs for development, repairing, redesigning, and reevaluating of items after failures, input and feedback, various facilities and locations which saw committees and meetings for said items, as well as testing and evaluations of them, presentations to different groups, boards, and individuals, and obviously reports and assessments published after tests were conducted for various iterations of the system across North and Central America, from Alaska for Arctic conditions to Georgia and Virginia for more temperate and general, to the Panama Canal Zone for tropical. There were even a few instances where discussions and production of items extended to England and even mainland Europe. So suffice to say, there was a lot and a bit of nitty-gritty when it came to details, and if it was all covered in this video, we'd be here for hours. So that being said, if you want to get more into the specifics of the LCE elements of LINCLOE, there are a few sources you can check out, which we'll list towards the end. Anyway though, final evaluations and reports were seen between October of 1972 and January of 73, with some final changes occurring as well as a few items being rejected, leading to the formal development and acceptance coming on January 17, 1973, with all approved items minus the first aid compass pouch and canteen cover being designated as part of the M1972 Lightweight Load Carrying Equipment, or LLCE, with initial production beginning shortly after. However, after contracts for the items were awarded, this designation was scrapped and replaced with the All-Purpose Lightweight Individual Carrying Equipment, or ALICE, as in 1973 the standard of naming military items, systems, or components after years was pretty much done away with. Now again, this was just the abridged version, as details are abound, and on top of more general adjustments and testing, other things were looked into, such as buckle types, stitch work, metallurgical elements, securing methods, and even items like this, which was a test into horizontal chest-mounted magazine pouches rather than vertical belt ones. But now would be a pretty good time to take a look at LINCLOE LCE, M1972, and ALICE pieces broken down by item, but it's important to mention a few things beforehand. In regard to LINCLOE pieces specifically, due to many of them being made in limited numbers, with photos even being scarce, only so much can be covered, so just keep that in mind. As for M1972 pieces being redesignated as ALICE, some of them were simply moved over, with their name changed from 1972 to LC1, short for Load Carrying 1, and in some instances LC2 after, when more changes were observed, for the most part. Additionally, with a majority of items being made of green nylon, various color shades were observed due to things like year of production, manufacturer, and obviously usage over time. However, by and large, earlier pieces were often seen in the darker olive drab 106 shade, while newer ones were changed to an almost gray-green known as green 483. So let's start things off with something that was really only exclusive to LINCLOE. Vests, of which there were two primary ones, the Vest Combat and the M60 Machine Gunner's Vest. Both would serve the same purpose, being able to attach and carry ammunition pouches and other relevant items related to firearms. The first one considered was the Vest Combat, of which there were two iterations with only one real difference between them. A part of the first generation LINCLOE LCE seen in 1968, the original model was in a way a sort of hybrid between a vest and suspenders, as the chest portion only went down to the mid-torso. Most of the photos shown here are of the second model, as the only real difference between the two was the front securing method, as the first utilized hook and loop with plastic snap buttons. However, after a 1969 meeting, this was deemed susceptible to fail, so they were replaced with the basic quick clinch release fasteners similar to the ones seen on ammunition pouches. Beyond that, though, they featured the following. On the front were nylon webbing loops, specifically 2 double-slotted ones by the shoulders and 2 quadruple ones down towards the bottom, allowing for the attaching of various ammo and equipment pouches. 2 straps below that held freely moving hooks to attach it to the belt. The back saw 4 straps for adjustment, all of which used pinch spring-style buckles, with 2 wrapping under the arms towards the front and 2 going straight down to connect again to the belt, and finally 2 more quadruple webbing loops to connect more items. Come 1970, though, the vest would be eliminated altogether as they were determined to be too elaborate and problem-ridden. That brings us to the M60 machine gunner's vest, which was added in 1969 after the first meeting at Fort Benning, with the request simply saying to provide a mesh vest capable of carrying 2 M7 assault packets or 1 T7 pouch. Like the M79 and combat vests, these were basic in design, seeing a mesh material make up the back and top portions with a solid nylon material making up the front and closure sections, which was secured via hook and loop and snap buttons. Ultimately, this too didn't last long, as the requirement for its development was deleted in 1972, right before standardization. But because these vests proved to be too complicated, that meant suspenders were still very much the go-to to hold up the belt. Sort of in the background initially, as it was very much an element from the start but not really focused on because of the vest, the first LINCLOE suspenders were requested in 1969 with a few requirements, such as wider shoulder straps, ditching the H design for a Y design likely to minimize the weight on the user's shoulders and instead divert it down the center of the back, and a one-size-fit-all design. The first iteration appeared between April and June of 1970 and was essentially a modified version of the M1967 in a Y design. Granted, it still had 4 points of contact, as the single back strap split at its bottom into 2 others. This was seen by way of 2 separate strips, while also featuring a pinch buckle for adjusting the length, which was also seen on the front portions too, which eventually proved to be problematic and adjusted come 1972, where they were replaced with non-slip, sometimes referred to as V-type buckles. As though they were meant for quick adjusting, they would easily give and were deemed unnecessary. When final approval was given, 2 minor things were changed. This can be seen in the M1972, which sees the small Y portion on the back section sewn on rather than connected via the rectangular metal ring, and the adjustability of it being increased by 4 inches or about 10 centimeters. Additionally, the D-rings on the front for support straps and hanging items were now moved under the web strips and changed to rectangular shaped ones as well. When they were switched over to Alice and renamed LC1, no changes were performed. However, after some of the hooks started breaking and warping, strength tests were conducted, leading to its requirement being increased to 200 pounds, or about 91 kilograms, resulting in the metal composition changing from brass to steel after 1977. The suspenders were again redesignated to LC2 in the early 1990s, with the largest difference being the color shade. However, if you look closely, you can also see that the shape of the snap hooks were changed from a curved to an almost square-angled one. Next up are the belts, which from a general standpoint really only changed as far as buckles and adjustment methods, but because of that saw continual tweaking leading to various versions. When it came to LINCLOE, the first version was pretty much an M1967 one with a plastic Davis-style quick-release buckle. However, after feedback in 1969, the central eyelet and hook method of adjustment was deemed too troublesome, leading to the entire center row of eyelets being removed completely, while the hooks were doubled down, now attaching to the upper and lower, while the Davis buckle was replaced by the older ball design, granted only temporarily. In 1970, this design with the hooks was entirely thrown out and replaced with a new clamp-type adjuster buckle, which would be carried over into the M1972 and Alice. Additionally, a request for a quick-release buckle was there too, and so the Davis came back, but now made of aluminum, as officials deemed its tendency to randomly unlock and open a minor one. This didn't sit well with test users though, and so again the older ball buckle came back when the belt was standardized with the M1972, though research into a better quick-release buckle continued. The belt would be redesignated as the LC1 with Alice, but would quickly see a minor change to its clamp adjuster buckles in 1975, seeing their design slightly altered and length shortened to lessen the chances of them breaking. Because of this, they would be redesignated as LC2. However, that wasn't the end of it, as the quick-release buckle research came to a head when the standard ball buckle went up against the Davis buckle and a newly designed gray plastic quick-release one. Proving to be superior, it became standardized in 1982 with another belt which kept the LC2 designation but saw a new NATO stock number, making it technically a different belt. Around 1990, the design would again be tweaked, but this time with the adjusters, which did away with the metal clamps, replacing them with 2 nylon bands secured by snap buttons, while the 4 individual retaining components were replaced with 2 toothed clamps, which were held down with 2 slide-over pieces. The 2 sizes would again see new NSNs, making them technically another item, but would retain the LC2 designation, even though these would be technically for use with Alice as well as IIFS gear. After this, there was one final change though, which came not long after, seeing the quick release buckle being switched out with a black side release one, and for a time kept the same designation, with later models dropping the LC2 altogether, meaning that in a way they started as an Alice item, but were slowly switched over to a general purpose one. Not including LINCLOE, all in all, standard belts saw a total of 2 adjustment and retaining methods, 3 different buckles, and 5 total belt configurations. Progressing to pouches, we have the first one being the Field First Aid Compass pouch, which is perhaps one of the most peculiar when it comes to development. The first iteration of the LINCLOE LCE pretty much just used the M1967 design, as it was simple and efficient enough, with the first changes to come being the snap button and dual hook side keeper adjustment piece changing to plastic as a way to try and mitigate potential rusting. These keepers would also see the addition of a circular top to allow vest and or suspender hooks to connect them if need be. When the second generation LINCLOE system was being developed, a requirement was added that these pouches be increased in size to allow for either 2 first aid kits or both the first aid and compass, leading to a design which essentially increased the side height while also adding a second snap so it could be securely fit around one item if the need was there. This requirement would pretty much be reversed in 1972, as the actual first aid kit contents were adjusted and the original design was deemed acceptable once again, with metal snap buttons and all. Upon standardization with the M1972, the pouches retained their M1967 designation. However, it was amended in 1973, seeing the type of drainage eyelet being changed. These would then be renamed LC1 at the end of 1975 after increased emphasis and changes to manufacturing processes, which improved overall build quality, were enacted, with the largest but unseen change being the increase of 2 to 3 layers of nylon around the areas where the snap buttons were attached. When it came to ammunition pouches, LINCLOE and Alice were relatively straightforward, but also one of the stranger in designs. Early ones seen were the M14 pouch, as well as 20 and 30 round M16 pouches, and were a mix of M1967 versions as well as slightly modified ones. However, after 1970 is when things really picked up, as the M14 and 20 round pouches were entirely dropped, as around that time the standard service rifle was the M16, frequently paired up with 30 round magazines. After a conference that year at Fort Benning though, it saw the addition of a few requirements, some good and some good on paper. First was the elimination of the bemoaned and often removed support strap, which would be replaced with a shortened one featuring a single eyelet, which now served the purpose of being the connection point for front hooks of either the vest or suspenders. Next was the changing of the method of attaching and keeping hand grenades in place on either side, which became a sort of open pocket with a nylon retention band secured by a metal snap button. After that was increasing the drainage hole's size, and finally a means to divide and secure the 3 magazines inside, which came in the form of 3 large curved flaps, all of which had snap buttons used to connect to one another as well as the sides. These were then made in decently large quantities and given to the Marine Corps for testing of their own, which is how many of them ended up in general service and used by forces during the Mayaguez Incident. However, they were universally hated, as the flaps inside got in the way of magazines, especially when trying to get them out quickly. However, these pouches would haunt many, as they continued to be seen on occasion mixed in with Alice for years to come, as they officially weren't canceled until 1989. The final version, as seen with the M1972, saw a few changes. Notably, the inside flaps were removed and replaced with 2 simple strips sewn from front to back, allowing for a much more straightforward dividing method. A reinforced zigzag stitch was applied to the binding tape on the grenade pockets, and a small polyester plastic piece was added around the front portion of the upper flap by the plastic latch fastener. When moved over to Alice, these remained exactly the same for a while, only seeing the LC1 designation given to them. However, later production versions bearing the green 483 shade appeared to have done away with the 2 interior strip spacers, making them completely open inside. When it came to the entrenching tool carrier, it both saw the greatest change but also the fewest. As with many other components, LINCLOE initially took versions of the M1967, an early experimental one featuring 2 plastic snap fasteners used to secure the top flap, similar to the one seen here, as well as the standard one. In 1969, that changed though, as the entire design was overhauled, seeing the nylon being completely done away with and replaced with ethylene vinyl acetate, more commonly known as EVA plastic. Being as the e-tool was all metal, heavy, at least compared to other items, and featured sharp elements, vinyl, even with plastic inserts inside, would rub, wear out, and eventually break, and so the plastic protection was expanded to the entire thing. The early iterations of these appeared pretty similar to the final, with the only real difference between them being the early ones used plastic snap button closures, were slightly smaller and had 4 drainage holes, while the final ones had metal snap buttons, was a little larger, and featured 5. Rounding out pouches was the canteen cover, which went through quite a few changes. The first model LINCLOE was virtually an exact copy of the M1967 version, but with plastic snap buttons, and instead of metal keepers featured the same plastic ones the experimental first aid pouch did. That design though was scrapped, leading to the second, which greatly deviated from it, seeing the same general shape but now went back to the metal keepers, had metal snap buttons, attached a reinforced horizontal band roughly at its center, which would help mitigate rubbing and fabric wear caused by the metal cup's lip, had its overall size increased slightly, saw some stitching differences on the back, removed the pile insulation on the inside, and most significantly opened up the bottom, seeing only a single nylon fabric strip. When the time came to evaluate it, this version was rejected, though some elements would be moved over to the final version. The reasoning for this was that the pile lining inside helped retain the shape, especially when the canteen was empty, which helped to minimize its collapsing or being damaged, while the opening at the bottom, though helpful with drainage and removal of items, proved to be a hindrance for concealing capabilities, as the metal cup at the bottom could cause reflections. The reinforced vertical band and size increase were kept, while a drainage hole was added at the bottom, and the closure flaps at the top were reinforced to lower the chances of them being pushed in when the canteen was inserted. When it officially became a part of the M1972 system, it, like the first aid compass pouch, retained its M1967 designation, but by 1974, issues again arose, primarily relating to the reinforced band. Though it helped to lessen the chances of rapid wear, it was still happening, and so amendments were made. The band was widened slightly and now stitched over the pile lining rather than under, the nylon thickness of the entire cover was increased, and the vertical stitches on the front were removed as they were deemed unnecessary. After a brief test period in 1975, these were well received and adopted with the LC1 suffix, which eventually switched over to LC2 later on, with no real changes short of color being observed. Moving now to the largest component, we find ourselves at the field packs, which were without a doubt the most change elements between the 3 systems. Regarding LINCLOE, it's a bit all over the place, as there were a number of revisions, both big and small, as well as entire overhauls of designs when it came to the packs, so we'll be covering the more general aspects. First up was the small nylon pack, known as Pack Small Combat, which shared a few similarities to the M1961 version, as it included a main top flapped opening which was secured by 2 central straps using the pinch-style buckles, a clear pocket on the back for ID or other paper material, a single external pouch on the front also secured by an adjustment strap, sewn nylon bands, some of which bore eyelets to connect a variety of pouches and items on either side, 2 vertical ABS plastic strips which were sewn on the back featuring metal hooks at the top and 2 metal loops at the bottom, which together allowed the pack to be connected to depressed and angled portions of the frame's crossbars, and finally 3 D-shaped rings, 1 at the top and 2 at the bottom on either end, which were used to connect it to the shoulder straps when not using the frame. Next up was the large nylon pack, officially Pack Combat Large, which utilized the same connection methods as the small, along with a central flapped opening bearing a small hook and loop secured slot for maps in its flap, along with a drawstring closure. 6 external pouches with 3 small ones towards the top secured by snap buttons and 3 larger at the bottom, which 2 were secured by snap buttons but could also be adjusted via pinch buckles. Equipment hanger straps and web loops on either side, as well as around the upper portion to attach additional items, and 2 central tightener straps using the same pinch-style buckles to secure the whole thing. After initial rounds of testing in 1969, officials requested a few changes to be made, with the most notable ones being that the small pack be 2/3 the size of the large, both have 3 large and 3 small pouches on the outside, and ensure the shoulder straps have quick release capabilities. Not all of this was seemingly adjusted, as testing on the original iterations continued with some additional modifications, but after seeing some issues in January of 1970, primarily with the small pack's polyester larger strips and connection methods, testing with the small packs was suspended and eventually cancelled in March, leading to the second generation of LINCLOE LCE packs. The newer versions of them, which mainly was angled towards the small, used the tropical rucksack as a basis, but was also starting to appear closer and closer to the final Alice versions, with evaluations of them being much better, with the only feedback being related to waterproof inserts, fixing snap button securing methods, and slightly increasing the size of small pockets on the large packs. But around this time, a third pack was thrown into the mix, a medium-sized one, which now some saw as one designed properly by also taking into consideration wearing without the frame, as the small and large had been designed to work better with the frame, while without was a secondary concern. Again, as time passed, updates happened with more focus put on modifying current packs to be worn comfortably without the frame, but that didn't stop the small packs from being cancelled entirely, as though issues were fixed and it was larger than the M1961 and M56 packs, it was deemed too small to be useful. Both the medium and large packs kept many of the same initial features when becoming standardized, with the primary changes relating to methods of connecting them to the frame or suspenders, while the medium pack saw its external pockets be sewn on rather than hooked on, as for a time they were detachable and could double as magazine or really general use pouches. Funnily enough, the large was considered too large for regular infantry but was deemed useful for special forces and in specific environments such as Arctic, where additional gear and supplies may be needed. And so the two were officially added to the M1972 as Field Pack Combat Nylon Medium, M1972, and Field Pack Combat Nylon Large, M1972, and subsequently changed to Alice shortly after, with both being labeled LC1. So let's first take a close-up look at the medium pack iterations and then move back to the large. The M1972 version and first iteration of LC1 had a federal and then NATO stock number that ended in 6480. It's important to note that, as later versions would see this changed. But let's now actually take a look at them. Much like LINCLOE, these had one single primary opening, which was closed by a drawstring and secured by a flap cover, which bore a small opening secured by hook and loop material, which could store flat items such as maps and papers. The inside saw a small pocket with the primary purpose to store a radio on its back, which could be opened or closed via a strap and pinch buckle, 2 drainage holes, and 3 pairs of laces towards the bottom, which, when tied to 3 D-rings located below the radio pocket, could more or less close off or shrink the pack so as to help with lighter or smaller loads. On the front of the outside, the primary flap was secured via 2 central straps, which ran down the bottom, being adjusted via the same pinch buckles. Right below the opening was a nylon strip with a series of eyelets and gaps between stitches, which ran the entire front, allowing for the attaching of various items and LBE equipment, including older ones which utilized the wire hook attachment method. Below that were 3 smaller external flap pockets, each of which had a drainage hole and used a dual snap button closure, which could be adjusted via pinch buckle. On its bottom and sides were more nylon loops and eyelets for attaching items, while at the bottom of each side was a D-ring used to attach the lower portion of a shoulder strap, and a strip with a non-slip buckle used to secure the pack to the lower portion of the frame. Finally, its back saw a small windowed slip-in sort of pocket used for identification, as well as a large padded envelope section at the top, which was slipped over the top portion of the frame to secure it, while also providing padding for the upper back. Above that were 2 rectangular rings, which were used to connect the upper portions of the shoulder straps. Another holdover from LINCLOE were 4 internal waterproof liners, which came in 2 sizes, 1 large for the main section and 3 smaller ones for the outside pockets. These would be added in and could close via laces at their tops, however they didn't fare very well, as you can see. This would be the case for the large packs as well. Originally issued alongside them in 1976, they were made optional in that users could still get them, but after the fact. Additionally, a revision was made to the pack, seeing the pinch buckles on the 3 outside pocket securing straps being switched over to the non-slip ones. This version would be given a new NSN that ended in 9102, however a few packs are out there that still retain all of the pinch buckles, such as this one. At some point as well, another version was made which did away with all of the pinch buckles save for the one inside. When the 1980s rolled around, a few more changes were seen, namely the discontinuation of paper care manuals being issued with them in 1984, seeing all future packs have instructions printed on the inside portion of the main flap. However, that was only the start, as with development of the IIFS gear, which saw an entirely new pack in 1987, these would start to be made in 2 versions, one in the standard green and another in woodland camouflage, both of which also saw the total number of eyelets along the nylon attachment bands and sections around the pack drop from 14 to 4. as well as the removal of internal laces and D-rings as they weren't that well received or really used by troops. The green versions would retain the same NSN ending in 9102, while the Woodland would be assigned a new one ending in 5335. Now, both the green and camouflage versions did see LC2 iterations appear around the early 1990s or so, and like a few other Alice pieces, didn't really have anything changed about them beyond the color switching from OG 106 to green 483. That brings us to the large packs, which were way more straightforward as they weren't used nearly as extensively. Original M1972 and subsequent LC1 packs bore an FSN and later NSN which ended in 6481, and shared a few things with the medium packs when it came to the main storage area, pocket flap cover, drawstring, dual securing straps with pinch buckles, internal radio pocket and lace and D-rings, back padded envelope for attaching to the frame, windowed slot pocket for ID, and side securing straps to brace it to the lower frame. Beyond that though, the differences were, on the front were two smaller nylon bands bearing eyelets for attaching gear rather than a full strip, as in between them were three smaller pockets with flaps secured by snap buttons. Below that were three more larger pockets, which though were adjusted and secured the same way as the medium ones, saw adjuster cords on the left and right ones to loosen or tighten their top areas. Their sides saw four nylon bands, two with eyelets and two without for hanging and attaching items, while their bottoms had three drainage holes and two strips to attach items, granted in the center rather than on the edges. And perhaps more significantly, a lack of connection points for shoulder straps, meaning they could only be used with frames. In many ways mirroring the changes seen with the medium packs, so too did the large ones, as when their liners became optional and the outside pocket pinch buckles were replaced with non-slip ones, did they receive a new NSN, which ended with 9103. Again, like the medium packs, the D-rings and laces inside were also done away with, care instructions started to be printed on the top flaps inside, and eyelets on the connector strips decreased from 12 to 4. But that's about the extent to which changes were seen, as likely due to its size and intended specialty and thus less common usage, they were never made in the Woodland camouflage nor gained an LC2 designation, even when they started to be made in green 483. Not including the experimental LINCLOE pieces, there were at least 7 iterations of the medium pack, 8 if you include the ones with M1972 stamps, and 3 but possibly up to 5 large packs when you take into account combinations between designations, NSNs, and features for a grand total of between 10 to 13, though that could also be higher, making them the most changed element of the M1972 and Alice systems. Much like how later LINCLOE packs were pretty similar to Alice ones, so too were LINCLOE frames, as they bore the same general shape in that they were somewhat rectangular overall, being mostly made of a single piece of tubing bearing an angled top section to contour to a wearer's back, centrally located vertical and horizontal reinforcement brackets, and a lower portion which allowed for the attaching of a cargo shelf on the outer side, as well as a waist strap and protective waist pad, which eventually would gain the nickname of kidney pad due to its proximity to them on the inner. Here are a few iterations of LINCLOE frames, which more or less include all of these features as they pretty much remain the same, seeing slight adjustments. Because photos aren't as abundant nor as high quality as other items, being able to go over every nuanced difference isn't really feasible, so here's a quick breakdown of some of the more specific changes starting from the top. Early on, the attaching of the shoulder straps was all done by way of hooks, with upper ones being connected via large D-rings. These would be altered to swiveling ones due to breaks and failures, but were eventually removed altogether. The other ends were clipped onto a small hole seen on the sides, but like the top portion, this too had many problems, eventually leading to the hole becoming far larger with the final version, while the attachment method for the straps were entirely overhauled. The reinforced brackets were adjusted and flattened, with versions seeing, in addition to the lower portion, hooks and recessed areas which allowed for early packs to connect to them. This method of attachment proved too problematic and would be done away with entirely, as seen with the packs before. One final and interesting section was a mid-back crossbar with a protective pad, which was added and then removed, as that eventually turned into the upper connection point for the packs. Of course, there were a few more specific things too related to reinforcements, weight, ergonomics, metal composition, rivets, angles, shapes, and so on. Eventually though, it would end up as the simpler and more efficient frame, field pack, riveted, and shelf cargo support lightweight M1972, which subsequently was redesignated LC1 later on. This version, along with the shelf, which remained mostly unchanged, was made of black hard-coat anodized aluminum and featured the overall same shape, a central vertical flat support bar along with a horizontal one, which could still hold said shelf, the diagonal bottom section which allowed for the attachment of the waist pad, which was still fed through the 2 large movable metal rings. On the outer sides were once the smaller holes where hooks of the lower portion of the shoulder straps would connect, were much larger ones now, used to accommodate their new attachment method, which could also allow for the hanging of other items. And finally, on top were 2 riveted square-shaped slots, which saw the top of the shoulder straps fed through them and connected back to them. Now, this frame mostly stayed the same during its lifetime, but eventually would see slight changes with its LC2 version, which really just increased the dimensions of a few elements and switched its colors from black to green, with later versions becoming more muted. As for the shelves, they remained entirely unchanged save for the color. Shifting to the shoulder and waist straps, we'll first take a look at them starting with LINCLOE and the first iteration of Alice, as they're both very similar. The waist pad was long enough to extend slightly past each end of the frame and originally were secured by friction-style buckles, which were prone to loosening over time and were replaced by a 5-piece system consisting of 2 threaded hooks, a single nut and washer, and a double-sided middle section which connected all of them together, while the waist strap was made of 2 pieces and attached to the frame by feeding it through the looped end and tightened, while the other end had a quick-release central connection point featuring a single snap-button top strap with 2 rectangular rings which had one rest in between the other, while a plastic clinch-type buckle fed through them, keeping them in place. Finally, push-down adjuster buckles were seen on either half. These characteristics would more or less be confirmed and standardized to M1972 and then Alice. However, the shoulder straps were a bit different. The more widely seen LINCLOE straps were pretty much rudimentary versions of the final ones, seeing hooks directly attached to an upper fully straight padded portion, meaning they would fall behind the frame and even cause a bit of rubbing on fabric, which obviously was not a good thing, and a lower portion with an adjustable strap with its connection point being another smaller hook. Amendments to this version would see a few changes, with the most notable one being the addition of a quick release buckle on one side, utilizing a similar method as seen on the waist strap. However, these would encounter a bit more tweaking before the finalized version, which featured a distinctive left and right strap. Seeing a basic almost uppercase L shape for the padded section, the top portion ditched the hook and now utilized a single strap, which would slot through the top brackets of the frame or the rectangular buckles of the medium pack, and then return down to feed through a non-slip buckle which was secured via another strap sewn down in a triangular shape. As for the lower portion of the strap, they were split into 2 sections, an open piece of webbing and a stitched closed one, which utilized a pass-through connection method to attach them to either the frame or medium packs. At the bottom of the padded section were 2 adjustment pieces which could increase or decrease the length of the straps, while the left used the same 2 rectangular rings and clinch buckle system for a quick release. Now, this multi-piece system was pretty straightforward and simple compared to the LINCLOE ones, but it still was a bit overly complicated and extensive, and so a newer design was created under the LC2 suffix. Looking at the waist pad, it was overhauled entirely, seeing a much wider and longer shape, which had 2 points on either end, allowing it to bend to better protect the sides of wearers. A simplified and shrunken down connection method which utilized a separate strap which fed into itself and locked in place, and an integrated waist strap that was much larger, could adjust easier thanks to bigger roller buckles, and took advantage of the newer quick release buckles as seen on later belts. When it came to straps, they too were overhauled, but not to such a degree, as they kept the same uppercase L shape for the padding, but now the lower portion wasn't padded, the upper connection straps no longer used the triangle shape band for the non-slip buckle, and quick releases were added to both ends but done in the same design as the LC1 waist strap, that being one with a cover secured by a snap button, while the same adjustment buckles were made. But we're not done yet, as there was a third version which technically kept the same designation but is sometimes referred to as the LC3 or LC2 Mark II. This version saw the waist pad change to the green 483 shade while becoming slightly larger and thicker, but also replacing both the attachment strap and waist release buckles with much simpler black side release ones, while removing the metal pass-through roller adjustment buckles on either side. As for the straps, they came in 2 versions, matching green ones, which are pretty uncommon, and ones with US woodland camouflage. These greatly overhauled the design, lessening the padded section's angle, but again padded the lower portion while also increasing padding and width throughout. The top securing straps were no longer stitched down and were all one piece that fed through stitched horizontal ones but retained the same securing method via non-slip buckles, while the lower portion's connection method remained mostly unchanged. The quick release areas on the lower section of the pads were pretty much untouched, as were the adjuster buckles. However, a 2-piece sternum cross strap with a side release buckle was added, which could easily be removed if need be, as the 2 halves simply slipped over the strapping. And that is pretty much all there is to it for the frames and associated straps and pads. Finally were the odds and ends, of which there were a few. The first was a straightforward utility strap, officially the Strap Webbing Cargo Tie-Down Lightweight Pack Frame 1972. It essentially was a universal piece consisting of a long nylon band with a hooked buckle on one end and an almost ratcheting snap piece on the other. These could be used for all sorts of things, but were aimed at securing anything other than the various field packs to the metal frames, as the shelves, as shown earlier, could be connected to the upper or lower cross sections, allowing for the carrying and stacking of various items. Interestingly, as it was first introduced with the M1972 system, it gained the designation of M1972. However, it retained it even after everything else changed to Alice. While still on straps, there were 2 other pieces, but really only one, though technically 4, the extender equipment belt. Seeing versions with both quick-release buckles, 2 styles were made. One with more fabric-type nylon, which seemingly was the more prevalent, and another with the same nylon webbing material as seen on belts. Technically not exclusive to Alice, they were frequently seen with belts, as they obviously helped extend their lengths, but often for the purposes of mitigating the frustrating task of adjusting them to fit over things like vests and plate carriers, cold weather and chemical gear, and really anything that would be big and or bulky. And last but not least were the 4 different pack covers, which were pretty much circular shaped cloth pieces with elastic bands around their edges used to cover either pack. These were seen in 4 versions or classes. Class 1 white for snow-covered terrain introduced with the system, Class 2 bearing the 6-color desert camouflage pattern for arid and desert regions added in 1980, Class 3 with the woodland pattern added in 1984, which predates the woodland printed packs by a few years, and last but not least the Class 4 with the 3-color desert camouflage print, which would eventually replace the 6-color created in 1990. But with those 4 covers, we've pretty much covered the intricate and highly detailed pieces of the M1972 and Alice systems, meaning it's time to get back to their story as a whole. Being standardized at the start of 1973 and redesignated Alice at its end, pieces started making their way to troops slowly, and for the first few years saw a bit of mixing with M1967 pieces and even older M1956 ones. Early appearances started popping up on smaller scales, seeing use primarily in Europe and the Middle East via yearly exercises such as Reforger through the late 1970s and Bright Star starting in the early 1980s, with one of its first usages in a hot zone coming in 1982 when Marines were sent to Lebanon as a part of a peacekeeping force. However, even then, pieces were still being mixed with older ones. But its true baptism by fire was seen in the Caribbean during 1983's Operation Urgent Fury, the US's 8-day-long invasion and occupation of Grenada. The system would continue on, seeing action with US troops in Honduras, Panama, the Persian Gulf, the Balkans, Somalia, Haiti, Afghanistan, and Iraq, with those just being the larger and more well-known instances, making it one of the longest, most widespread and used systems the US ever fielded. While all this was going on, though, testing continued to try and improve upon and even redesign how equipment could be carried by troops, eventually leading to the IIFS system, appearing in the late 1980s, which was mentioned earlier. Though we won't go into great detail about it here, suffice to say it led to a few packs, pieces, and vests, which didn't quite replace but supplemented Alice, though in a way it was the first step to its ultimate replacement. About a decade later, MOLLE, or the Modular Lightweight Load-Carrying Equipment System, entered the scene, and pretty much revolutionized how equipment could be customized and carried to meet all sorts of needs and requirements. And though it began to be issued to troops, Alice continued to stick around. However, by the early to mid-2000s, it wasn't really being fielded all that much, at least in its complete form. Today, save for the occasional item like an ammo pouch here or a pack there, like the title of Martin Scorsese's 1974 film, Alice doesn't live here anymore. Outside of the United States military, though, that's not the case, as early as the 1970s, other versions of it were observed, such as the tan-colored version for Saudi Arabia. From there, it would see recolorings of all sorts for commercial purposes, from the same tan being used by certain US personnel to all black ones and even camouflage components. To add to this, standard US pieces would continue to be used by forces around the world, either as ones given or sold to them by the US, replicated and integrated into other systems, or outright copied and or recolored. All of this combined, coupled with it obviously being seen hundreds of times in media, makes Alice arguably the most seen system in either its original form or altered slightly, which altogether just showcases how much staying power and to many coolness factor the Alice system has. As mentioned earlier when discussing the LINCLOE Project timeline, there's a lot more to it, and if you want to look further into it as well as Alice, there are quite a few sources out there. When it comes to the basics like proper assembly, usage, and care of pieces and components, there are a few different official manuals, be they specifically for Alice, or a number of items compiled that you can get a hold of. Be they in the original physical form or ones turned into PDFs available online, there are great sources for the more hands-on and tangible side of things. As far as testing and experimental pieces go, that's a little different, as being that it was decades ago and on a much smaller scale, the info in its original form is not as readily available. Due to various locations, years, and reports, info is scattered and not always presented in great detail, at least when it comes to visuals such as Pouches photographs. However, there are a few reports for LINCLOE available online, as well as some Natick Labs photos posted from field testing. The place to start is a 1975 technical report titled History of the Development of the LINCLOE Load-Carrying Equipment, which was published after ALICE was standardized and essentially gives a general history of the endeavor while also telling in greater detail the continual back and forth that was encountered. Now, chances are good as more collectors and those interested in related pieces continue to research and discuss, other documents will come out in complete and easy-to-read formats, and if that's the case, links to them will be added in the description below. Finally, a great source for it, as well as a few other items from before and after, is the book American Web Equipment 1967 to 1991 by C.A. Monroe and Craig Pickrell, which goes into specifics about a lot of things as well as provides some further references. So that was really long, but worth it to properly cover arguably one of the most famous and widely used military load-bearing equipment systems ever conceived. Obviously, due to the sheer number of items made over a few decades, all pieces are still readily available for reasonable prices, and unless you're looking to try and collect every iteration of every piece, which is a daunting task, believe me on that one, putting together or just collecting the ensemble isn't that hard. A good place to start is Gear Rack for that. Again, thank you guys, and while giving out thanks, a very special one to user Keystone from the US Militaria Forum, who provided a number of photos of the LINCLOE pieces. With one of his bigger focuses being US web gear, he's been constantly sharing and discussing pieces over on the forums, so you can always look around there for more info too. But with that, we've come to the end of another video. Hopefully this long anticipated and highly requested topic was entertaining and informative to many. If you're new to the channel, perhaps leave a like and subscribe. If not, no sweat. Just be sure to check back again really soon for more of the history of right here on Uniform History.